So before we get moving into the art, okay, so Jasper Johns worked in the 1950s, and his work moved away from Expressionism towards an art movement that is now known as the concrete. I'm not teaching it to you as a specific art movement. Just know that Jasper Johns sort of paves the way for assemblage. He depicts flags and maps, and I don't think he set out to make a brand so much as he set out to explore these materials as a jumping off point for his art. He uses targets and maps and flags, and those images at the time that he uses them were brand new to the art world, and his artwork led into minimalism. He grew up wanting to be an artist, moved to New York in the 50s, and studied at the University of South Carolina for a brief time. He met artists in New York City like John Cage and Robert Rauschenberg. He was highly influenced by Duchamp's ready-mades. And Duchamp's ready-mades influenced John's found objects in his art. So once he sees Duchamp, meets Duchamp and sees Duchamp's work, he starts including found objects into his work. His early works added a sense of craft. They had a sense of the extraordinary and the absurd. In his associations with Robert Rauschenberg, he meets important collectors that give him gallery space for his work. And eventually, the MoMA buys 3 pieces of his work, which propels his art career. He believed that the process of creating art was the art, not necessarily the finished product. The product was simply a byproduct of the process, which was the art. He was a printmaker. He often made prints that accompanied his multimedia sculpture or multimedia paintings. And his paintings had a cross between assemblage and just painting, because he added objects into the painting. A lot of times he would create a painting and then make a print that sort of went along with the painting, and I'll show you an example of that here in a moment. When he did printmaking, he used mostly screen printing. He used lithography and etching and developed new processes that revolutionized the field of art. Later in his career, he collaborates with Andy Warhol, Robert Morris, and Bruce Nauman. So this is Jasper Johns' target painting. In general, Jasper Johns targets the notion that the meaning of art comes from the individual. Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns think that when the artist uses an image that's already been contextualized by society, the meaning of that object can't be divorced from the viewer's thinking. Meaning, when you use the image of the target, it has an inherent sense of meaning to the viewer who's looking at it. To some people, that target is a reminder that their dad took them hunting every Thanksgiving. For others, the target is sort of a caution sign. It implies an associated sense of danger. The target that Jasper Johns paints is one that is a regulation target used in hunting sports. He recreates it exactly the way they use it in hunting. And it's a familiar image. It has some ambiguities because a symbol is something that means something specific for each person that looks at it. So you can't automatically imply that it means a hunting symbol. Here's a better example that I could think of from modern day. When I think of a target, who do I think of? Target the store. Then I think of bullseye, the white dog with the red concentric circles around its eye. If Jasper Johns had made this a red and white target, people today would automatically think of the store Target. See how that works? There's an association with the symbol. Jasper Johns did not set out to create a branding. However, his art talks about branding, does it not? It says this target inherently means something. And so target paintings, map paintings, and flag paintings tend to be associated with Jasper Johns because it's a lot of what he painted. He also used found objects in his art. He knew Duchamp, and he was heavily influenced by Duchamp's use of the ready-made. At the top of this particular piece, you see body parts that have been plaster cast and painted. So this is Jasper Johns' target painting. In general, Jasper Johns targets the notion that the meaning of art comes from the individual. Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns think that when the artist uses an image that's already been contextualized by society, the meaning of that object can't be divorced from the viewer's thinking. Meaning, when you use the image of the target, it has an inherent sense of meaning to the viewer who's looking at it. To some people, that target is a reminder that their dad took them hunting every Thanksgiving. For others, the target is sort of a caution sign. It implies an associated sense of danger. The target that Jasper Johns paints is one that is a regulation target used in hunting sports. He recreates it exactly the way they use it in hunting. And it's a familiar image. It has some ambiguities because a symbol is something that means something specific for each person that looks at it. So you can't automatically imply that it means a hunting symbol. Here's a better example that I could think of from modern day. When I think of a target, who do I think of? Target the store. Then I think of bullseye, the white dog with the red concentric circles around its eye. If Jasper Johns had made this a red and white target, people today would automatically think of the store Target. See how that works? There's an association with the symbol. Jasper Johns did not set out to create a branding. However, his art talks about branding, does it not? It says This target inherently means something. And so target paintings, map paintings, and flag paintings tend to be associated with Jasper Johns because it's a lot of what he painted. He also used found objects in his art. He knew Duchamp, and he was heavily influenced by Duchamp's use of the ready-made. At the top of this particular piece, you see body parts that have been plaster cast and painted. So the next artist we're going to look at in terms of assemblage is Robert Rauschenberg. Rauschenberg creates hybrid creations, and he begins producing art in the mid-1950s. He uses the art of collage, but instead of using like bits and pieces of an object, he uses the entire object, which really is a statement against the backdrop of the abstract expressionists like Jackson Pollock, who didn't want any recognizable objects to be in his art. The MoMA publishes a book on Rauschenberg called, that's like a one-on-one in conversation with Robert Rauschenberg. And he talks about his education and his travels to Spain, Italy, Morocco. All of those places would have been places where he would have seen art from Picasso to the great masters of Italy. He first started using found materials in his artwork when he attended school at the Black Mountain College in Asheville, North Carolina. He was a student there, and every student there is required to pitch into some sort of community service. So he volunteers for the garbage collection. He ends up using objects that he finds in his classmates' trash in his art. In conversation with the MoMA, he states, "I consider the text of a newspaper, the detail of a photograph, the stitch in a baseball, and the filament in a light bulb as fundamental to the painting as brushstroke or enamel drip of paint. In the end, what one sees as my work is what I choose to make with no guarantee of enlightenment, humor, beauty, or art." So in the end, he really didn't care whether you considered it art, whether he had changed your life with his art. He really did art for the sake of creating it. In that way, he is like Jasper Johns, who felt that the art was something that happened in the process of creation and not necessarily the end product itself. This is Robert Rauschenberg's Canyon. You can see that it has a bald eagle affixed to the canvas and the stick. Rauschenberg was given the eagle for the painting from a friend. He recalls receiving a call from a friend from fellow artist Sari Denise. She wanted to offer him a taxidermed bald eagle she had fished out of a junk heap in her neighbor's garbage. Her neighbor had recently passed away. He was one of the Teddy Roosevelt's last Rough Riders, and so he happened to have this bald eagle. Rauschenberg had recently become famous for incorporating all types of found materials into his art, and so this kind of offer was an offer that was not unusual from his friends. And so he tended to take these type of objects. In the image, The Canyon, there are a variety of objects around the eagle, including a photograph of his son, Christopher, a postcard of the Statue of Liberty, a man's white shirt cut and opened up, a crumpled tube of paint, fragments of printed words, and industrial metal drum. So you can see that he sort of capitalizes on the art of putting things all together in one painting and still making it visually appealing. Without me telling you that there was a metal drum cut apart and put on the canvas, you probably would not have noticed that that was a metal drum. Here's another one of Rauschenberg's work. It is a silk screen. It is a nude woman looking into a mirror at herself. In the background, you see the background of a city. In the foreground, you see an interesting picture that looks like it has an eyeball on it of some sort. It has been in the possession of the Rauschenberg Foundation now for many years. The Rauschenberg Foundation is one that draws on Rauschenberg's legacy in his life and in his work. It supports artists, initiatives, and institutions that take the innovative and inclusive approach to art. Rauschenberg was a philanthropic person and was very inclusive in his giving. Okay, so I had a little bit more on this painting that I wanted to kind of scoot in there, so let's go back to it for a minute. Following his print activity, Rauschenberg begins silk screening. I told you that about that particular work of art, but he silk screens large found images on canvases. So that's new. That's a new process that he uses these found images and creates silk screens out of them. He takes images from the daily papers and creates this complex composition. He looks at the works as almost a filming process because he uses close-ups and cuts and dissolves various parts of the background and the foreground, sort of as if you were rapidly flipping a dial on a television. So this is Louise Nevelson's work. This is Tropical Garden 2, done in 1957 and 1959. Nevelson drew inspiration from Dada and Surrealism to express her own personal stories. She felt that multiplicity was an important part of life and that the real meaning of life was revealed in the space of the in-between. So times of transition, times in which you are going from one thing to another. She says that's where the real meat of life is. The boxes that she creates have their own found object composition. They are little miniature sculptures within themselves. And then she puts them together to create one large sculpture in which she paints all one color to unify it and make it look as one cohesive work of art. Sometimes the end of the sculpture will have a lid that opens and closes to one of the boxes. So I've seen some of her sculptures have lids in various places that open and shut some of the panels or some of the boxes. They're quite fascinating. She's the only one I know of that has ever done a sculpture in this manner, in that she does these miniature boxes and then paints them all one color. So anytime you see a Louise Nevelson work, she's pretty easy to identify because her look is so very distinct. Typically a relief sculpture or a sculpture that is attached to the wall that has found objects inside of a box that is usually has right angles. She doesn't use boxes that are round or curvy. They're typically rectangular or square. And then she hooks the boxes all together, colors them one color, and there you have it. a recipe for Louise Nevelson's work. Okay, so we are now moving on to minimalism. This is a minimalist sculpture by Donald Judd. Donald Judd worked in the late 60s, early 70s, and he was the first one to use plexiglass as a material. He came from this idea that he wanted to create art with the absolute bare minimum materials that he could. And so at first, he starts just building boxes. He builds boxes made of all sorts of materials, of wood, of metal, of plexiglass, of glass. The very first sculptures, though, they were made of wood. And he would create them himself. He would take hand tools and make the squares all perfect and the same. And then at some point he realized that instead of making things by hand perfectly, it would make a lot more sense to have them manufactured so that they were 100% perfect. And so he continued to make sculptures out of wood. I think he got a little bit bored with the repetition of using the same old material in the same old shape. And so he then starts playing with opacity. Opacity is the ability to see through the material. And so he then makes these sculptures out of plexiglass that's tinted different colors, sometimes having metal edges, other times having all see-through glass. This is minimalism at its best. It is conceptual. It is the idea that you're creating something with bare minimum pieces that is aesthetically beautiful. Okay, so I wanted to give you a couple of views of this particular sculpture. We talked about Judd and how his works transitioned into this clear form of plexiglass. Here is another vantage point of the composition. You can see from the bottom that it has this really extreme streamlined feel to it. Like I said, Judd used to build these by hand, but eventually decides that he's going to send them out to have them mass produced. And he felt that using that mass produced piece was not taking away from his art. He felt that he took that mass produced piece and used it in a way that benefited his art. Here I just wanted you to be able to see this fact that you can see right through the work of art. It makes a big difference in terms of how you view it. You can see sort of the world through it. Okay, so a little bit more about Donald Judd. Judd is really considered a pioneer of minimalism. He died in 1994, but he really didn't embrace the term minimalism. You'll see in the video clip that's next that that's true. He begins painting in the 1940s and turns to sculpture in the 60s. If you ask him why he decided to turn to sculpture, he'll tell you a simple answer that is, I wasn't getting what I wanted from painting. He produced these box-like freestanding forms that were wall-mounted, like you've seen in the past few slides. And he outlined his approach in a treatise called Specific Objects. He then assembles a complex of buildings and land around his studio in Texas, where there were large-scale works of art. They would draw in a steady stream of visitors. His actual home, though, was in New York, in Soho, and it has actually recently been open to the public. MoMA's chief curator of painting and sculpture said, half a century after Judd establishes himself as a leading figure of his time, his legacy demands to be considered anew. They just did an exhibition of his work, and she said not only quintessential objects from the 1960s and 70s, but also works made before he arrived at his iconic formal vocabulary and selections from the remarkable developments of the 1980s. So if you're interested in Judd, I highly recommend that you go to the MoMA and look at works of art that Judd has done.
Donald Judd.
How do you feel about the term minimal art?
Well, I don't like it, What's minimal about it?
Well, do you think that there are a group of artists whose work in some way is related, who could be called minimal artists?
No.
Do you think that sculpture is exhausted?
In the first place, I never thought of my work as sculpture.
You began as a painter. Why did you stop painting?
The easiest answer is I couldn't get what I wanted with painting. In regard to both the color and the material, these are things that I consider primarily given. They already exist in the world. And I'm interested in using them as they are and in their nature as they are. There is no space as a something that continues throughout everywhere. And that there is no time that goes on and on and on and is something all by itself. They're made by something happening in them in the case of time, or by something existing in them in the case of space. But the time and space in themselves are just the way we feel about it.
Donald Judd.
How do you feel about the term minimal?
Okay, so this is Sol LeWitt. He was born in 1928 in Hartford, Connecticut. His parents were Russian Jews who immigrated to the United States at the end of the 19th century. His father was a doctor. He died when LeWitt was young. He was only 6. His mother was a nurse and encouraged his early interest in art. He took art classes when he was young, and he liked to make drawings on wrapping paper that he found where his aunt worked. He majored in art at Syracuse University and was drafted for the Korean War. His only on-duty job ever for the Korean War was to make posters. Some of his first jobs were in New York City in the 50s as a graphic designer for 17 magazine and an architect. He also was a salesman at a bookshop and a night reception at the Modern Museum of Art. Okay, so that last little bit might have been a little confusing. That was the video that the MoMA had about Donald Judd, and I think brings into light information or just his attitude about his work. So now we're going to move on to Sol LeWitt. LeWitt stressed the idea behind his work over the execution. His work is widely regarded as one of the leading exponents of minimalism and conceptual art. It's known primarily for deceptively simple geometric structures and architecturally scaled wall drawings. His experiments with his experiments with minimalism really culminated in 1968 and were considered quite radical. Partly because this is a completely new form of drawing. It was temporal and often executed just by Lewitt himself. But oftentimes, when he would sell a piece of art to a gallery or to a museum, actually what he was selling was the instructions for executing the work. He came up with the conceptual idea, but the museum was the one that actually had to carry through the art. There were other artists and students that he invited to assist him in creating the installations of his work. Each of his wall drawings begins as a set of instructions, which is really what he would have been giving the museum or the purchaser, or a simple diagram to be followed and executed in the piece. The straightforward instructions end up sort of roping the curator into executing his work. You get a large variety of work that is simple yet complex, rigorous yet sensual. The drawings in the particular exhibition range from layers of straight lines to meticulously drawn lines that are delicately rendered. They tend to be bold black and white geometric forms. You see bright planes of acrylic paint that are arranged like panels in a folding screen. That's not so much here. He really has a wide variety of work. These drawings and installation pieces typically culminated like this. Now, he did do some sculpture, and those sculptures look different than the works of art that he has, in which he executed works of art through drawing and installation. The forms appear somewhat flat. They really don't recede into space or project into the viewer's space. But installations such as this one seem to meld into place. So in Solowitt's sculptures, he tends to think conceptually. Now, we saw that he thinks conceptually when planning room design, right? So the drawings that he did, he planned conceptually. Someone bought the drawing and executed it in terms of an installation in their museum. Points of departure for Solowitt are the pyramids, the ziggurat from ancient Near Eastern art. He feels that leaving the recognizable object behind helps him to create his main point in the work of art. He felt that the concept was most important part of art, which, if you examine the work that we just looked at, is definitely the case. He wrote in Artforum magazine in 1967 that when an artist uses a conceptual form of art, it means that all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand, and the execution is a perfunctory affair. The idea becomes a machine that makes the art. This kind of art is not theoretical or illustrative of theories. It is intuitive. For Lewitt, his intuition guided him into creating the conceptual. And so you end up with these interesting forms that begin as a recognizable object that he then flips on its head and shows you a new viewpoint. That is something that is true from all of the artists that we've looked at in this lecture. If you go back to Jasper Johns was looking at type that already had a sense of design to it, right? But he's only looking at the type not for the thing it is itself, but for the thing that it can be in terms of its formal elements in art. So, for example, the number 8 has a very curvy presence to it, and he wants to use it for its formal elements, for its curvaceousness. When it comes to artists like Jasper Johns, the symbol of the target has formal elements to it, and he tries to use it as an object, but knows that that object brings inherent meaning to it. Lewitt does something similar. He takes that object and sort of divorces the art from the recognizable object, creating a completely new object that's different than what we're used to seeing. That doesn't look, the work of art that you're looking at right now doesn't look at all like a Great Pyramid, but it was the point of departure for Sol LeWitt when he created this sculpture. So those type of things are things that artists in this era begin to figure out, how can I take something that already exists and make it new? Now, if we go all the way back to Picasso was the first one to say, let's stop and think about what we actually see and document something new. That idea of documenting something new is a voice that only the artist carries. It's the voice of innovation in art. Just like you get new discoveries in science, they happen in art as well. It's about the innovation of the artist's mind. All right, so Robert Morris teams up with Carolee Schneem. Now remember, we talked about her mostly in performance art. And they create this work of art together called Sight. It was a performance piece, but I put it in here because it is Robert Morris who did the Al Beams, who works in minimalism. The piece was performed at Stage 73 in New York in March of 1964. It involved a series of choreographed actions accompanied by the soundtrack of a jackhammer, which erupted from a white box placed downstage and to the left. Morris himself dresses in white and wears a mask and work boots. He dismantles a construction of rectangular boards to reveal a woman. So she's sitting on stage in a box, basically, and he's deconstructing the boards and reveals this woman. The woman is Carolee Schneeman. She's lying motionless on a sofa in the manner of Manet's Olympia. So if you don't remember Manet's Olympia, go back and look it up. You should have an image of your mind of this woman that's reclining, propped up on an elbow, staring directly at the viewer. After a series of physical movements with each board, he covers up the model again, and the stage goes dark. This is part of a larger trend in feminist performance art. of reenacting paintings and asserting the agency of the depicted female protagonist. Manet's Olympia was shocking because the painter had depicted with great realism the prostitute models who gaze immodestly to confront the viewer. Schneemann's performance, again orchestrated by the male artist, animates that return gaze. So it's a statement, right? It's something about we've taken this work of art that is already iconic in the history of art, and we're doing something new with it. It's got a little it's got a little performance art to it. It's got some site specificness to it. And then it's got this building concept to it as well. It's a fascinating work of art because it takes all of these avant-garde ideas and conceptually sort of mushes them together. So you end up with like the cherry pie of conceptual art. If this interests you, I highly encourage you to think about doing it as your research project if you are in my Art History 2 courses, or just to further your exposure to art and the conceptual ideas behind works of art that are created by artists like Robert Morris and Carolee Schneemann. So an artist who comes out of the minimalist tradition is Richard Serra. He's an artist that wants the viewer to experience the materials that he uses in terms of their physical qualities. So, for example, the sculpture that you see him standing in front of now was made of steel. It's large, it's massive, it's heavy. He plays up the rust part. He wants the viewer to walk into his sculpture and feel the coldness of the steel, to feel the weight of the steel and the rust on the surface. He wants the viewer's brain to experience the material as he experienced it, as he was making it. Serra has made installations in a number of galleries by hurling hot molten lead at the gallery walls and letting them burn and scorch and fuse into place. He is abstract, he's process-based. The suggestion of hurling lead into crevices deals with the manipulation of the material. Somewhat comparable to abstract expressionism, only in sculpture. If he could, he would peel away the material from the wall and use that material as the art. He is one of the preeminent American artists and sculptors of the post-abstract expressionist era, beginning in the late 60s to present day. His work has a major role in advancing the tradition of modern abstract sculpture in the aftermath of minimalism. Now, you're going to see a few works of art that are going to be 100% minimalistic. And then you see works of art like this, in which he sort of plays on abstract expressionism. This is an interesting thing about modern artists, is that it's hard to pigeonhole them into one category. So in this case, I would tell you he's both. This isn't the first artist we've seen that sort of fits in both spaces. The way you differentiate between the periods of art has to do with the qualities of work. Just like Picasso, we saw his Guernica that seemed like it would go better into surrealism, but because Picasso made it, it goes into synthetic cubism. Similar concept. Serra explored how an artwork might relate intimately to a specific setting, how it might take up a physical space as well as a visual relationship to the viewer. And how it might create spaces or environments in which the viewer could experience universal qualities of weight, gravity, and agility. His most famous work is titled Arc, and it's a work that was commissioned by the federal government to go into a plaza in New York City. It was a public space. The tilted arc is a panel of cold rolled steel that is 120 feet long and 12 feet high. It is somewhat confrontational with the public in this public space. It dislocates the decorative function of the plaza and actively brings people into the sculpture's context. The wall was described as having brutality in its reduction, forcing itself uncomfortably on the viewer, dictating paths of movement around it. Its monolithic massiveness felt frightening, even somewhat dangerous, with its unforgiving wall of steel overpowering anyone in its range. It had massive weight that could crush you in an instant, and the public reacted with hostility as soon as the work was installed. It had disturbing qualities, and it caused the federal government to have it removed shortly after it was installed. Here you can see how massive it is, and how visually disturbing it was for those walking around it, behind it, or near it. You can see how the snow is piling up against it. The work still exists, it's in storage, but its removal irritated Sarah, who said to remove the work is to destroy the work. Sarah accused the government of censorship and filed a lawsuit for infringement of his First Amendment rights of freedom of speech. He insisted that the artist's work must be uncensored, respected, and tolerated, even if deemed as abhorrent or perceived as challenging or experienced as threatening. The federal district judge held that the removal did not constitute censorship. So here I ask you, who do you think was right? Is the nature of public art, in the nature of public art, what are the artist's rights and responsibilities to the public commission? What is the purpose of public art? So another artist who is familiar with minimalism is Maya Lin. She was a 21-year-old student at Yale when she submitted a design for the Vietnam War Memorial. Her work was selected out of 421 entries and immediately caused debate when her selection was made public. Radio shock jocks like Pat Buchanan said that this black coloring and movement down into the ground was symbolic of defeat and dishonor, mocking the services of those who sacrificed their lives for our country. The idea of the Vietnam War Memorial Wall was conjured up by Jan Scruggs. Scruggs was a Vietnam vet and founded a memorial fund. He began to raise funds after asking U.S. Congress for the funds, and they did not comply. Eventually, he raised over $8 million in private donations, along with $2,800 of his own money. In 1980, the government finally acted on Scruggs' idea, and President Jimmy Carter designated land for the memorial. A memorial committee was formed, and a competition for public entries was established. The memorial committee establishes a criteria for entries that were to be contemplative and reflective in character and not a political statement. Also, the memorial had to be cohesive with the surroundings that bear the names of those who died in the conflict or who were still missing. There were a total of 1,421 entries. Memorial officials chose the winner based on the design alone. The artist would not be revealed until the winner was announced. In 1981, while a senior at Yale, Lin's Vietnam Memorial proposal won. Along with the production of her design, Lynn was also awarded a $20,000 contest prize. It is indeed minimal, pristinely simple in design, and consists of two 246 feet long V-shaped black granite panels that begin at the ground level and gradually grow to a 10-foot height where they meet at the center. It is set in the landscape in an area between the Lincoln and Jefferson Memorial, and it contrasts their white marble rising forms from the ground, as it is a black descending form piercing the ground. So visually, it's somewhat opposite of the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson Memorials, because it sinks into the ground and because it's black. The Jefferson Memorial and Lincoln Memorial are both white and they rise from the ground. Along the entire length of the monument are the names of 57,939 dead and still missing servicemen and women. They are engraved on the walls in order of their deaths. Myelin countered her opponent's criticism of the work with a moving description of how it works upon the viewer. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is not an object inserted into the earth, but a work formed from the act of cutting open the earth, dematerializing the stone to pure surface, creating an inference between the world of light and the quieter world beyond the names. In this case of site-specific minimalism, that is extremely successful. The debate over the sculpture did lead to a compromise inclusion of traditional figurative sculpture of the Vietnam soldiers some distance from the walls. Do you feel that the figures are necessary to honor the war dead in a public memorial? Here you can see that when a viewer goes to the memorial, the granite is so shiny and reflective that you can see your own reflection. But the names that are carved in the memorial also are reflected out at you. It has this eerie sense of artisticness that I think Myelin counted on in terms of her design. Frederick Hart actually is the one who designs the sculptures around the memorial of the more traditional images of the soldiers. If you go there, if you've ever seen the Vietnam Memorial Wall, I think the soldiers feel somewhat out of place. They don't make a lot of sense until you see the other memorials that utilize the soldiers. I would say the Korean Memorial, this is where the figures of the soldiers become more tied in to the rest of the art. So this last work of art that we're looking at is by Robert Smithson. It is called Spiral Jetty. It's 1,500 feet long and approximately 15 feet wide. It is a monumental earthwork that was created by Smithson. It's located off of Roswell Point in the north arm of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. It's made of basalt rocks and earth gathered from the site. And it's a 15-foot wide coil that stretches more than 1,500 feet into the lake. It is the most famous large-scale earthwork of its time. it has come to sort of define land art. Robert Smithson was attracted to the site in Utah because of its remote location and because the water had a reddish quality because of the algae in the lake. This is a close-up of the ecosystem of the jetty. So the size of the earthwork is, like I said, 15,000 feet, but it's affected by the seasonal fluctuations of the lake level. So right now, the material rises from the site a few inches above the water line. But during the time of, depending on the time of year, it might be completely covered in water or it might be more exposed. Smithson was interested in something called entropy. It's a law of physics in which it's a law of physics that explains how nature breaks down man's effort over time. Smithson originally made art for galleries, and he got to the point where he just decided, you know what, enough's enough. I want to move my work outdoors. And so he became sort of disenchanted with the galleries and felt that they were mausoleums for art. He felt like they were too bound up in commodification and commercialization. And he felt like those concepts were foreign to the true artistic spirit of creating. And he wants to reconnect with the environment. And so he uses his art to create works of art that are site specific and that integrate with the environment. He creates this 457 meter long spiral by bulldozing material from the seashore and the lake. It's so large it sort of dwarfs the way, or it dwarfs the person looking at it. You feel a sense of smallness as you stand in the middle of it. He really wanted to connect with not only the lake and the earth, but also the stars, every bit of the outside that he could. We know that he was somewhat thinking of technology and scientific discovery at that point. The mouth of the terminal basin is very rich in minerals. It's also almost completely devoid of life. And so Smithson's fascination with entropy lended itself to the idea that he would build the structure and then the structure would inevitably disintegrate. It's constructed from 6,650 tons of rock and earth. It continuously changes as a form of nature and as time take effect. I mentioned that he was thinking about space. It's because just before he created the piece. Neil Armstrong was the first human to set foot on the moon. And there was a sort of reevaluation of the relationship between us on Earth and the cosmos. The jetty has a galaxy type shape, but when the viewer walks around it, they walk around it in an anti-clockwise direction. And so it tends to not only prompt the viewer to consider cosmology, but it also to move backwards through the geological sense of time. Here you can see a close-up of the coral at the jetty. This is what it looked like in August 22nd of 2002 and on April 6th of 2004. This is June 26, 2004. In August 2008, this is what the spiral jetty looks like today. You can see the ecosystem has completely died and returned to the earth. Remnants of the work are still there, but will someday completely return to the earth, just as Smithson intended. The interesting thing about this work of art is that it was gifted to a foundation by his wife, a foundation in New York City. And his wife, even though he intended for it to disintegrate and return to the earth, his wife wanted it preserved. She didn't want it just to drift away and return to the earth. She felt like it was an important work of art and she wanted it preserved. And so she gifted it to this foundation. It still exists. It's still part of the foundation's art piece, but someday it won't exist at all any longer. Very much like Smithson's partially buried woodshed that he did in 1970. The partially buried woodshed was something that he did as a guest artist at Kent State University. This is him creating the work of art. This is what the work of art looked like whenever I was there. And this is what it looks like today. They have gotten rid of it and planted a tree over top of it. And here are the woods where it was. So the idea of its decomposition back into the earth is something that Robert Smithson very much wanted to have happen with his work.